right, good evening. Can everyone hear me? Yeah? Okay, good. Like Damon said, my name is Steffany Meredyk, and I'm excited to be here tonight to talk to you about my involvement on a research project called Stories of the Susquehanna. And I worked on this project while I was an undergraduate student at Bucknell University in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. So what we're going to do tonight, if you're all on board, is we're going to jump out of Montana. We're going to travel all the way across the country in like 40 minutes, not 40 hours, I promise. And we are going to jump into the Susquehanna River watershed. I'm going to start off tonight by introducing the Susquehanna, talking about where it is, what the landscape's like, how I found myself there. And then I'm going to give kind of a brief outline into the human history of the Susquehanna River, focusing mostly on the contact period between groups of Native Americans who have been living in this watershed for thousands of years, and kind of the point of contact when early European explorers and settlers kind of come into this area as the colonial frontier kind of moves westward into the watershed. And then for the rest of the presentation, I'm going to talk about some of the particular projects that I worked on under this umbrella of the kind of Susquehanna history. And these all revolve around the use of GIS, which is Geographic Information Systems, essentially technology used to make maps. And my kind of projects to take the history of the Susquehanna and combine it with this interest in mapping and geography to kind of try to create these place-based storytelling maps of the historic Susquehanna. Before I move on from this slide, this is the Susquehanna River. This is not me kayaking, but you'll see that shortly. And then this map is just one of my favorite historic maps of the Susquehanna River. It dates to the turn of the 19th century by an engineer who is actually, he creates this beautiful 17-foot watercolor map of the Susquehanna. And the reason why he's mapping it is he's actually going through and essentially blowing up rocks in the river to kind of increase navigation. But he does produce this really beautiful, huge watercolor map of the Susquehanna in its destruction. The Susquehanna River is the longest river system on the east coast of the United States, and it's the 16th largest by volume in the entire nation. So if you were to float, or attempt to float is probably the better way to put it, down the entirety of the Susquehanna, you would flow about 440 miles before eventually entering the Chesapeake Bay. So I will try to use this. The Susquehanna River originates out of Lake Otsego in New York. It flows down out of New York into Susquehanna until it reaches this point, which is known as the confluence of the Susquehanna River, which I'll talk about plenty. At this point, this is called the North Branch. And then at this point, the West Branch meets up with the North Branch at this confluence. They flow together to create the main stem of the river, which flows south through Pennsylvania, past Harrisburg, which is the state capital, past Lancaster, Washington Borough, which I'm going to talk about, and then eventually into Maryland and into the Chesapeake Bay. This map kind of shows the entire watershed of the Chesapeake Bay. As you can see, the Susquehanna watershed is kind of monstrous, and it contributes over half of the fresh water to the Chesapeake and makes up a very big proportion of its watershed. So I found myself on the Susquehanna when I went to school at Bucknell University in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, which is located about 6 miles upstream on the West Branch from this confluence, this very historically significant place. And like Damon said, I studied history and geography, which you're going to see a lot of maps and hear a lot of stories tonight. And I was able to kind of combine these two interests by working on the Stories of the Susquehanna project for 4 years. I actually started the project my first weekend that I went to school as a freshman at Bucknell when I knew absolutely nothing what I was doing, and I worked on it to one of the last weekends before I graduated. So I definitely got my kind of 4-year dose of Susquehanna history. Because the Susquehanna River is so large, it's also one of the oldest river systems in the world. Depending on where you go in the watershed, you're going to experience a very different landscape, and you're going to feel like you're experiencing a very different river. So the Susquehanna River can kind of be broken down into 3 different ecoregions to help you kind of understand the landscape of the Susquehanna. you have this kind of upper region here, which is the Appalachian Plateau and uplands. So you kind of have more topography, a higher elevation. The river kind of winds through this kind of mountainous terrain. Then as you go further south into Pennsylvania, you have this pink version on the map here, and this is the Ridge and Valley province. This area is characterized by long linear ridges and valleys. So basically what you have is bunches of folded rock, and you have these high sandstone ridges and then these lower limestone valleys that the river kind of cuts through. So you have these big sandstone ridges going the entire expanse of the river in this area. Then as you go further south into the lower Susquehanna, Pennsylvania, and into Maryland, you have this Piedmont version, which is a much flatter. There's significantly less topography. There's a lot of agriculture in this area. You also get some hydroelectric dams on the Susquehanna in this area, which kind of characterize the river. Most of the research that I'm going to talk about and that I did at Bucknell kind of takes place in this pink area here around the confluence. So it's this Ridge and Valley province. Right here you can see a photo. This is actually taken, so if you're on the confluence on this main stem and you're looking toward this west branch, this is an example of one of these sandstone ridges that you're going to see as you're traveling up and down the Susquehanna. It's kind of hard to see because of the trees, but you start to see these linear kind of folds of sandstone. In the snow, in the wintertime, it's easier to see. You can see these plunging layers of sandstone that have just been built up and then folded together, and then the limestone valleys eroded away. This is a photo from on top of Blue Mountain, looking over the confluence where the West Branch and the North Branch meet to flow south into the Chesapeake. All right, so this is a photograph of what it means to be a researcher on the Susquehanna working on this project. This is a hard day at work. This is actually in one of my humanities classes where we were learning about the history of the Susquehanna, and we were also able to go out and do a lab on the Susquehanna and go on the river and experience what we had been learning about. So what appears like an innocuous kind of photo promoting student engagement, actually, this is me in the back, and what you don't know about me is that I'm terrified and have a great disdain for any sort of boating-related activity. So I greatly appreciate the Susquehanna. I've learned so much about it and appreciate what it means over time to different people, but I am much happier on one of those ridges looking over the river. And at this point, I have been on the river for like 3 minutes, and I am already like counting down the seconds until I'm on land again. So this is a very rare photograph. Not too many of these exist. For good reason. All right. For the next couple slides, I'm going to share kind of a brief historical background of the Susquehanna, both in pre-contact but then mostly contact period, which is what I researched. Before I start, my disclaimer is that I'm not an archaeologist. So I have training in history and geography, which means that when I'm performing research, I'm kind of parsing the historical record for information on how people have experienced the Susquehanna over time. And I'm particularly interested in seeing how spatial representations kind of persist in that record and how we can use those to learn. So unlike an archaeologist would, I'm not going out into the field and kind of looking at material culture and learning from that. Any information that I know and will share with you about the archaeology or the pre-contact period comes strictly from archaeological research, primarily resources that are put out by the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission, as well as other literature talking about archaeology in the valley. Archaeologists believe that indigenous people were using the Susquehanna River Valley as early as 11,000 years before presence. There are several Paleo-Indian sites in the lower Susquehanna at this Washington Borough complex, which is still in Pennsylvania but nearing the Maryland border. Archaeological site density continues to increase, 10,000 to 4,000 years before present, and there are many archaic period sites in this lower Susquehanna Washington Borough area, as well as scattered around the rest of the watershed. Archaeologists have recorded significantly fewer sites in this middle woodland period, and they believe that this is because the Susquehanna climate is changing constantly, and this is a much warmer, wetter time period. So they're not sure if there might not be as many people inhabiting the valley, or their records are just not persisting. So soon later, you see the establishment of year-round occupation sites on the lower Susquehanna. In 1250 AD, you see the emergence of Shanks Ferry culture people, which is a distinct group of indigenous people who kind of take over this lower Susquehanna area. They're there for about 300 years, and then 1550, you see the mysterious disappearance of the Shanks Ferry culture people and their replacement with a Susquehanna Indian culture. And the Susquehannocks live in the lower Susquehanna, and they live in very large fortified villages. The largest site in Washington Borough was believed to hold about 3,000 people living there at one time. There are also many other groups of Native Americans who are moving through and living in the valley. Delaware Indians, you have Iroquois, Nanticoke, Conoy traveling into this area throughout all of these time periods. The Susquehanna Indians are actually the first indigenous Susquehanna people to appear in the historical written record. This is kind of where my research begins, and they make this first appearance in a map. The first record of an indigenous people in the Susquehanna comes from a map made by Captain John Smith in 1608, and it is a map showing his expedition to explore and map the entire Chesapeake Bay, which hasn't been done before. So Smith travels through the bay, and he travels all the way to about the mouth of the Susquehanna River, and this is where he stops. This here, I don't know if you've seen this image. This is Smith's depiction of the mighty Susquehannock. And it's a super interesting image to me, just what a commanding presence it has over the entirety of this map showing all of the Chesapeake Bay area. So this is a piece of the map depicting the Susquehanna. Here's the mouth here, and then the Susquehanna goes up. This is probably around the confluence. And then it goes to represent the Susquehannock. So while Smith is camping at the mouth of the Susquehanna River, Susquehanna Indians come and meet with him, and they trade, and they talk about stories. The Susquehanna Indians describe to Smith the location of 5 Susquehanna Indian towns on the Susquehanna, and Smith plops these down on his map. So you're also seeing kind of this first record of a spatialization of human history in the Susquehanna River. Smith describes the Susquehanna Indians as seeming like giants. He also describes them as gentle and kind of hard to be seen, seldom seen. After this first recorded contact between Europeans and Native Americans in the valley, interaction between the two kind of increases exponentially. There's no going back, basically. You see most of this early interaction centered around trading furs for European goods, also the extraction of white pine trees in the area. You basically start seeing more explorers, early settlers moving into the same space that the indigenous people are occupying. And that's when this kind of contact period really emerges. The first permanent contact period, or trading post, in the valley is established by an Englishman in 1634 on Kent Island in Maryland in the Susquehanna. This resource produced by the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission looks at some of the goods in addition to furs that are being traded during this time period. So you see tools such as an axe, you see brass arrows, as well as European pottery and native pottery, and then also wampum, which is these glass beads that are a very important kind of significant currency for the Native Americans in the area. In addition to trading goods, you also see kind of the idea that these people are coming into contact. They're sharing ideas about the land. They're sharing ideas about their histories, where they come from, how they farm. So you get much more than just the trading of goods. They're also bringing disease into the area, which I'm sure you can imagine. Disease and warfare become prevalent in Susquehanna culture in this mid-17th century. as they begin to fight with these early explorers and traders, as well as their Iroquois neighbors to the north. The results are not so good for the Susquehannocks. By the turn of the 18th century, this war and disease have nearly decimated the group, and the Pennsylvania colonial government decides that they're going to set aside this small tract of land in the Conestoga Manor outside west of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. They're going to set aside this Indian village, move all of the remaining Susquehannock Indians there, call them Conestoga Indians, and essentially give them this little plot of land. So this is one of the first instances you see of this, great people kind of being relocated and being told, this is your new home. You can live on this very small plot of land when you're used to being a very mobile society, which doesn't go well, again, as you can imagine. So there are enough stories that come out of the 18th century kind of Susquehannock contact period to fill the car ride that it would take for us to get there. I could just talk about it the whole time. But I'm not going to do that tonight, so I'm just going to give kind of the briefest of brief overviews of what was going on during this time. The River Valley was definitely in a transformative time period. 1700 and on, colonial settlement is kind of constantly expanding from the east, crossing the river into the west. You no longer just have trading posts. Colonial settlements involve houses, they involve farms, moving families. So you get community structures like churches, you get mills, stores, additional trading posts as these kind of early colonial river towns set up along the river. These colonial structures, as you can imagine, and you can kind of see on this map of the mid-18th century, this is the confluence and this is the main stem. You begin to see houses, George Gabriel's house, McKee's store, Barry's River crossing. These structures also aren't tents or very movable things. They're very permanent structures. So along with these kind of permanent settlements, you get ideas about property rights, and you get ideas about owning land and controlling land and profiting off of land, which are relatively new to the Susquehanna Valley and aren't necessarily work well with indigenous ways to think about landscape. This is the part of my talk when I talk about kind of some of the heavy, more notorious history that comes out of the Susquehanna during this time, conflict between Native Americans and colonists. This is by no means the only story to be told, though. My mentor and one of the professors that worked on stories of the Susquehanna and kind of helped me through everything for 4 years, Dr. Catherine Fall, she studies what she calls the Shamokin Thanksgiving. And basically what this is Shamokin used to be a town, right here at the confluence. And it's basically a Moravian settlement of Moravian missionaries who come into this river valley working with an Iroquois chief called Shikellamy. And these two get along and they kind of create this Indian town together, missionaries and these native people who you really see, we call it the confluence of cultures, because you see kind of this peaceful intercultural understanding. She studies their Thanksgiving in 1747, and it's definitely not big turkeys and pilgrims, but they exchange foods that each other like, and they have this kind of Thanksgiving together. The peace does not necessarily last, and it's not prevalent on the Susquehanna landscape. So in the mid-18th century, with the emergence of the French Indian War, you see a lot of violence. Multiple colonial families were murdered by a party of hostile Delaware Indians in Penn's Creek, known as Penn's Creek Massacre, in 1755. This, along with many other events, sparks fear in the residents of these colonial towns. The Moravian mission at Shamokin is abandoned, and the colonial government sends up an expedition to build Fort Augusta, this kind of military nation building in the Susquehanna to prevent future attacks. This fort doesn't really necessarily quell any fears going on in the landscape. This results in what is known today as the Paxton Boys Massacre. of the remaining Susquehanna Indians in Conestoga. So in 1763, people from Paxton, which is kind of just off the map down here, go down the Susquehanna and murder what's left of the remaining Susquehanna Indians in the Conestoga Indian town. One other unfortunate, not so happy story to talk about that I'm going to share later, so it's worth mentioning now, takes place in 1779 on the north branch of the river as General John Sullivan marches up the river to destroy 60 Iroquois villages along the river, and he kind of takes his army, and they do this in one summer. All of this goes to say that in the 200 years in this kind of early contact period, the Susquehanna is changing. The people who are there are changing, how they're thinking about the land, how they're setting themselves up in the landscape. It's definitely a transformative period. And this is just a very brief snippet, of course. So I mentioned before, I'm not an archaeologist, so I'm not out in the field looking for material traces to learn. So what are some of the kinds of sources that I use as a historian or as a geographer to kind of learn about these events? Lots of scholarship, whether that means looking at a county history book that was produced in 1850, kind of talking about the history of that county, or whether or not that means what historians are studying today about landscape or Native Americans. In the Susquehanna, we used a lot of primary sources in the forms of diaries that settlers kept, as well as letters that they sent to and from each other, and kind of colonial edicts sent from the government to people in each community, kind of expressing this is what you should be afraid of, or this is what you should be doing. Was really interesting. I'm interested in using historic maps, both Western maps, which is of course what you see most of the time, and then there are a couple indigenous maps of the Susquehanna, which are really, really cool to use and look at. It's definitely a whole different ballgame than the Western maps. I'm not going to touch on those today. And then, of course, going into the community and visiting local historical societies along the Susquehanna and seeing what they have in their archives, and meeting local historians and river guides, people whose families who have been on the river for years and years and years and can tell you their experience of the Susquehanna as well. Okay, now to the fun part, at least for me. Now I'm going to talk about GIS. So as I'm kind of doing this research as a student, I'm a history student, so I'm learning about all these cool stories that I really want to tell and share with people. At the same time, I'm also a geographer who's learning how to use technical software like ArcGIS to produce maps of things and to do spatial analysis of things. So I decided that under the branch of the Susquehanna project, I was going to learn how to use this kind of technical software in order to get it to do the historical analysis and make the kind of maps that I wanted it to make. So that's what I did. What you're seeing right now is just kind of a view into a very basic GIS. So what it looks like when I'm talking about working in a geographic information system. You have kind of a large display where you're displaying your spatial data. So right now I just have a satellite image of the Susquehanna River. Here's the confluence, again, in the main stem flowing down. You have all your tools up here, and then you have a table of contents on the side which shows you what kind of data is in your GIS, what you're spatializing. One of the many ways that a GIS can store data and turn it into maps is by storing it in different layers. So a layer can contain a bunch of points on a map, a layer can contain a bunch of lines on a map, and it can also contain polygon shapes on a map. And it just organizes it into these separate layers. So for example, if you knew a lot about colonial forts and you wanted to produce a map of them, you would produce a layer that had a point at each colonial fort that you wanted to talk about. And then in order to make different maps, what the GIS does is it basically just piles the layers on top of each other. So if you start off with a satellite image and then you have a layer that shows information about Native American Indian paths, kind of plop that one on. And then if you wanted to see how the paths correlated with the forts, you could plop that one on. You could turn them on and off. You can set transparency difference. You can see different layers through other ones. It's a really powerful tool to see the relationships between different kinds of data that, if you're looking for patterns to where things are in the landscape. So essentially, when you're creating all of these layers, you're making a spatial database. What's really important, what a GIS does, which is really important, is it also stores tabular information. So when I make a point on a map to represent a fort, the GIS doesn't necessarily know whether or not I want to talk about a historic fort and tell these stories, or whether or not I just want to point to a little point, a GPS point on the ground. And I can guarantee that if you went to this GPS point, you would find absolutely nothing. But instead, what these points kind of signify is a place to tell a specific story of a place. So this is a good place to talk about Fort Halifax. This is a good place to kind of understand this history, and this is the sphere of influence of this piece of history. So what a GIS does is you can make these points and lines, and then you can also store any sort of information you want with it. So when you're talking about forts, you might want to know what other names they had from different people. You might want to know, their years of influence, when they were on the landscape, as well as a narrative describing what the fort is. And then there's also source information, which is also very important if you're trying to keep track of things. So one of the biggest challenges to using this kind of technical GIS software in a historical context is that every time you want to tell a story, if you want to talk about a historic person, if you want to talk about, this really cool event, you have to associate it with a point, a line, a shape, an image, which is really hard when you're dealing with records that are 300 years old, a map that a cartographer made, and you can't quite figure out where he was, and the rivers aren't lining up, or you're trying to locate something that was written 300 years ago in a diary. They're not necessarily being super specific about where their location is. It's definitely a challenge. If anyone has the key, I would be happy to hear it. It's the question of all questions for me. But one of the methods that you can use using this kind of GIS is to georeference a historic map. This is not one that I georeferenced. Couldn't find a good example. But this is one georeferenced by a student who was working on the Susquehanna before me, kind of laid this kind of precedence down. And basically what you're going to do if you're going to georeference a historic map is you have a map, a historic map, and then you have the area in GIS, some kind of base map. Emily used stream data, this kind of river and stream data. And she found a point on her historic map, Wyalusing Creek, and she knew where it was on the historic map, and she knew where it was in the GIS. She essentially, georeferenced it, clicked both points, and it stuck it together. And the GIS recognized that that's the same point. If you do that with several points on a map, if you can find several points that you know are in the right place, like a point up here, point up here, point here, the GIS essentially kind of skews the map and fits the historic map onto this kind of Cartesian idea of space that the GIS so desperately needs to use, and historic maps don't often. So in this way, you can kind of see a historic map, how it fits on the landscape today. You can digitize things off of it. So if there's a site, you can make a shape and then pull it out so that you no longer need the historic map, but you still have the data. For the rest of my presentation, I'm going to talk about 3 projects that I did, kind of, a little bit about the history of the Susquehanna, a little bit about why I wanted to use GIS and how I was doing it. So now I'm going to talk about 3 projects just briefly that I worked on. The first project is by far the most extensive and the most time-consuming, but also very rewarding. As a part of the Stories of the Susquehanna project, we wanted to create a digital cultural atlas of the Susquehanna Valley. Essentially, the project is a very big project. You have professors from a bunch of different universities, students who are coming in and then leaving, all doing incredible historic research and spatializing their data in different ways. And we wanted to make one database, one kind of mapping application that we could throw all of that into in an organized fashion. So when the next student comes along researching, they're not doing the same thing, and they can see what I thought about the landscape, and they can jump to different conclusions or the same conclusions. Basically what this entails is a bunch of those layers that I described before just kind of being put into the same database. So we had layers talking about different historic Native American sites, Moravian missions, ferries, forts, all types of colonial structures that we had digitized, not necessarily, again, to be able to find it on the ground, but saying that this is an area in which this is where, the Conestoga Indian town was, the general area. If you're going to talk about it and if you want to explore this history, this is a good place to do it. This is the point at which you should. So in this kind of spatialization, you have a lot of data. You have narratives about different sites. You have all of the sources that it came from, so that if I make a site and it looks completely wrong, someone can go back into my sources and see whether or not I was just totally goofed up or there's some kind of discrepancy that should be looked into more. One of the coolest applications that I've seen come out of this project occurred on the lower Susquehanna. So it's this kind of Harrisburg south to the Chesapeake Bay. And basically, once we had accumulated this data, and it's just about a quarter-mile buffer on each side of the river, so it's more of a digital cultural atlas of the Susquehanna River rather than valley. But we gave this data to the Chesapeake Conservancy, which is a land conservancy based in Annapolis, Maryland, that focus on large-scale landscape conservation. And what they did is they took this historical and cultural data, and put it into their conservation opportunity area tool. And they have this on their website. So they basically took our GIS data and put it in with all of the rest of layers they had. So they had layers on kind of the ecosystems. They had layers on public access to the river. And they kind of put this all into one tool. And it's really cool because if you want to go into the Susquehanna, lower Susquehanna, and look at where do I want to invest in land conservation. If historical and cultural properties are important to you, you can select that importance to high. And the map it produces for you is saying these are areas in which there are historical and cultural properties. And if we're looking to conserve land and this is important, these are the areas in which to do it. The map is essentially saying these are the areas in which we can talk about cool history for the Susquehanna. The tool becomes even more powerful when you start to play around with selecting importance for various things. So if you're looking to conserve areas where there is a presence of historical and cultural sites, which means we can talk about the history of the Susquehanna, but you also want people to be close to a place where they can get on the river and kayak. So that if you want to have people talking about the history, learning about the history, and also experiencing the river and being able to go down to it, you can kind of use the tool in this way, and you get an even more detailed map of saying these are the areas in which we can really talk about history and we can use the history in the Susquehanna. So it was a really cool project to be able to see them do that from that data. Another project that I worked on was actually the first project that I worked on and the first map I ever made. And what I wanted to do is I was really interested in maps and I was interested in spatializing data, but I was also doing all of this really cool historical research and these primary source journals of people. And so I decided that I wanted to make maps, but I also wanted to use that really cool primary source documents, and I was just going to put them together and see what happened. So a little bit background on this map. This is not merely overrun, but destroyed the Sullivan Expedition against the Iroquois Indians. During the American Revolution, Iroquois Indians gave divided military support to the American colonists and the British loyalists. So as a result, General George Washington ordered John Sullivan to take an army in 1779 and invade Iroquois country. So they left from eastern Pennsylvania, traveled up the north branch of the Susquehanna into the Finger Lakes, Iroquois area. Sullivan's troops destroyed nearly 60 Indian villages in the summer, and leaving not only a path of the physical destruction, but also the destruction of Native American communities and cultural systems. So when I made this map, what I wanted to do is I took the historic map of the Sullivan Expedition, georeferenced it, and then I wanted to pull off the path that the trail took along the river, as well as where they were camping and kind of the dates that go along with this expedition. And then I also wanted to add in data about the Native American sites that we knew were there and knew that were destroyed during this time. This is just kind of a zoomed up area of one of the maps, which kind of shows this area that they traveled. And then it's probably too small to read, but I started just I took journals from 2 of the soldiers who were marching on this expedition and took out some interesting inserts and put them along the journey so you get a sense of what they're experiencing as they go. I mean, it's really interesting because, one day they're talking about, I think in one of these, they're talking about how it's really boring and they're just camping and there's a lot of fish and there's these deer in the wood, but the deer keep getting scared and they're like, all of these deers. And then the next day they're talking about, this horrible kind of murders that are happening and destruction, burning of these fields. By the end of, the path kind of goes up. By the end of the journey, they begin to talk about some of the sicknesses and the people on their own journey, soldiers, friends who have died on this journey. So you begin to see kind of the full circle decimation that this expedition had on the landscape and had on these people. So it was a really interesting kind of exercise in cartography. I was inspired by Margaret Pierce's work. She's a geographer out of the University of Kansas, and she does kind of narrative cartography like this, where she's making a map, but she's also really asking you to engage in a story and sit there and kind of read it. This is a poster. It's like this big, maybe. The final project that I'm going to talk about tonight is very different from a poster, which kind of sat in my classroom and I don't think reached as wide of an audience as I would have liked. This one was very much focused on engaging people in the history. So this is an ArcGIS online interactive digital storytelling map, which is a lot of adjectives that describe this. This map was created in GIS and then published online using ArcGIS Online. So basically, it's available online for someone to go in and zoom in and out. And you can go on the map and you can scroll all around and kind of walk yourself through. But we've also curated this history, these stories around the confluence, this very historically significant place that I've talked about a lot. So we basically wanted to tell the story of the Susquehanna confluence going back 1,000 years, the convergence and fall of these Indian paths and native peoples moving through the area. Then we kind of moved on and we wanted to talk about Shikellamy and this Moravian mission and this kind of intercultural awareness that the confluence has seen, this kind of light. And then we also acknowledged the darkness in the history with Penn's Creek Massacre and this building of Fort Augusta. So the story kind of it allows the user to kind of go through, and they're essentially walking themselves through. I mean, you can zoom all the way in or you can zoom all the way out. And you just kind of set the parameters to make sure that the users kind of stay where you want them to stay. And you kind of set the story up so that you're kind of curating this story of the Susquehanna, but the person's still walking through. You can click on these images and it will take you to other links and it will link you to other maps and other resources that can really engage you in the history if you're going to sit here and kind of play. It's really fun on an iPad. We would go to events and give people iPads and say, here, like, engage with this history, please. And they'd just be swiping along. So it's a really fun way to kind of engage with the history and very different from kind of the static print map. If you would like to play with any of these maps or any of the ones Bucknell has, I would encourage you to go online to ArcGIS and play and explore the history yourself and zoom all the way out as far as you can go and then zoom all the way back in. It's pretty fun. And then if anything that I've talked to you about tonight is at all interesting, I would encourage you to go to the Stories of the Susquehanna website, where you can get lots more information than what I shared with you tonight, and links to some really cool, beautiful historic maps, as well as some of the ones that we created as part of the project. Thus ends my presentation tonight. So now we can transport back to Montana. This is me looking at a historic map with my mentor, Katie Fall, who I mentioned. I look very happy, so I'm probably learning something on a map, which probably made my day. The Stories of the Susquehanna initiative has a lot of collaborators in a lot of places. Chesapeake Conservancy is one I mentioned before. They have a large Envision the Susquehanna campaign, which is really meant to kind of bring attention to the Susquehanna and decide that now is the time that we're going to start interpreting the landscape and conserving it and preserving it for the future. They work with the National Park Service, and we kind of consult and work with Iroquois and other Native Americans, which is a really interesting, fascinating way to kind of pull in all of these multidisciplinary parts to this project. With that, I will thank you all for coming tonight.